Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar hosted by Building Movement Project and Solidarity Is, called We've Been Here Before, Nonprofits Confront Crises. We're really grateful to all of you for joining us. We know that this is a difficult time for many. Even though in most states we've been sheltering in place for 6 weeks now, the weight of this time wears on each of us in different ways. We send you all our care and support, and we hope that the conversations that we are curating offer connection to community for each of you, ideas to implement, and catalysts for action. Today's webinar is the second in our Nonprofits and COVID-19 series. A month ago, we hosted a webinar on how Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American movement leaders were responding to COVID-19, which highlighted the structural racism being exposed by this pandemic. And today, we're going to be exploring lessons to be learned from past crises. Before we get into that conversation, I want to go over a few logistics. So you are likely quite used to the Zoom technology by now. This is a webinar, so the only people with their videos on are the panelists and myself. If you'd like to communicate with us, including asking questions for the panelists, you can do so using the Q&A function in a respectful manner. The chat is not available on this webinar. We'll also be sharing resources and the recording as well as the transcript afterwards. Now, if you're able to multitask, we encourage you to join us on Twitter. Please use the hashtag COVID in our communities. I want to actually put up a poll right now because we want to get a sense of who folks are as folks continue to come in. So we wanted to know what sector you work in. So if you want to take a moment to just answer that question, and as you do that, I want to take the opportunity to thank a number of people who have been invaluable in putting this series together. I want to thank Kathleen Foley for outreach and logistics and organization. I want to thank Francis Conrider and Sean Thomas Brightfield, who are the co-directors of Building Movement Project, for their vision, and Olivia Pena for her support with this webinar series. So I think we can end the poll now to take a look at what we're seeing here. And not surprisingly, most of us on this webinar are part of the nonprofit, movement-based advocacy organizing sector, as well as social service agencies. We also have representatives from philanthropy, government, and academia as well. So thank you to all of you for being here. We know that this issue is an important one for all of you to be learning about, and we're really excited to be providing this knowledge. So I want to provide a little bit of information about Building Movement Project. So we are a national nonprofit organization that strengthens social change organizations and networks through our research, trainings, and tools. You can see on this slide various reports that we release, including Race to Lead, about people of color leadership in the nonprofit sector, as well as our visual tools and exercises, including the Social Change Ecosystem Map and the Movement Leadership Stool, and our Solidarity Is This podcast. On COVID-19 is a reflection of this commitment to strengthening social change organizations. And in addition to this series of webinars, our staff are writing articles about the racial equity implications of COVID-19, and we're also pulling together a report based on a survey and interviews with nonprofits that are led by people of color. To that end, we would love it if you all could share your input and your knowledge as we seek to understand the effect of COVID-19 on organizations and communities of color. So if you are a person of color on this call and you lead a nonprofit in your community, please take the survey. It takes 10 minutes to complete. The link is there, and we'll also send it out afterwards and in the Q&A as well. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context as we get started with the webinar here. And as I mentioned earlier, we held a previous webinar as well, and we come to this conversation with the benefit of learning from our last webinar, one that was held down really by women of color who lead Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian community groups. And on that call, it was very clear, as you know, that the pandemic is exposing the multi-generational effects of white supremacy, nativism, and capitalism. We learned about various effects of COVID-19 on communities of color, communities with highest needs. These range from barriers to care and access to care, including high rates of illness and death for communities of color. In hotspots like Louisiana, Detroit, and Washington, D.C., Black communities are facing higher rates of illness and death. People in Navajo Nation and other parts of Indian country are also facing access to care issues. We're also seeing health risks for queer and trans communities and disabled community members. In addition, when it comes to the economy, increased rates of unemployment being reported by Latinx community members, the rights of essential workers are in question, and many cannot access the stimulus packages that are coming out from the government. And another angle to the effects of COVID-19 is around violence, criminalization, and enforcement. We're seeing an increase in gender-based violence, as well as an increase in anti-Asian racism. We're seeing anti-Black violence in the form especially of armed vigilantes and the rise of white supremacist groups in this moment. The racial disparities of enforcing shutdown orders and government monitoring and surveillance in this moment. These are just some of the many effects that we're seeing of COVID-19, particularly on communities of color. So in this moment, as we actually ground ourselves in the present realities of what is happening, we also wanted to take some time to learn from the past. What is the reason for doing that, to, in the midst of a crisis, to look back and see what happened before? And I want to start with this quote by Ella Baker, who said that in order to see where we're going, we not only must remember where we've been, but we must understand where we have been. And so in order to do that, we have asked three people to really tell us about the ways in which they've learned from the crises that they've worked on. And our goals for this conversation are threefold. We want to understand and explore the similarities and differences from past crises and COVID-19, specifically from the standpoint of nonprofits led by people of color. And we want to understand and explore what various sectors, from government to philanthropy to nonprofits, that you all represent should be doing right now. So the three crises points that we're focusing on, and there have been many public emergencies, obviously, over the past 2 decades, but the three that we're focusing on today include September 11th and its aftermath, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the Great Recession of 2008. We're going to put up a poll right now to get a sense for whether you all have worked on any of these crises points before, because it's really important, we feel, to draw a through line when it comes to these three crises of the past and what is happening in terms of COVID-19. So we'll take a moment to see how folks have responded in the past, and it looks like, as we're about to close the poll, about half of you have voted, so we're going to go ahead and close it. It looks like actually 86% of you are working on COVID-19, but there are segments of the audience here that did respond to 9/11, as well as Hurricane Katrina and the Great Recession as well. So it'd be great to hear your insights to supplement the insights of our panelists. And also, if you worked on other types of crises and public emergencies, please feel free to share those in the Q&A as well. So we're going to share these results really quickly and move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there are through lines in terms of what has happened between the crises that we have been through before, whether that is 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina or the Great Recession. So everything from the failure of government to be responsive to our communities, the divestment of resources from those who need them, catering to capitalism over the needs of people, disparities facing people of color, from displacement to discrimination to government surveillance, and really begs the questions, what have we learned, right? And do these systems work, if at all, in terms of our people? And what is the role of nonprofits, as we'll see in the next slide, in really attending to the crises that happen in our communities? And typically nonprofits are really part of all three of this particular crisis cycle that you can see on your screen, from relief to recovery to reimagination and rebuilding. Nonprofits have been frontline responders. When it comes to relief efforts, they have been part of recovery efforts in terms of influencing decisions and policies, and they've obviously been part of reimagining and rebuilding systems and policies and institutions through the lens of equity and solidarity and inclusion. So to learn more about how that has been possible in the past and what we can learn from that and what is important for the future as well as the present. I'm so pleased to welcome three panelists who are just remarkable people as well as advocates and leaders. And I'm really also grateful to them for taking time to join us because I know that you are extremely busy right now. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time to join us. So a little bit about our panelists in terms of introductions. Seema Agnani is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development, or National CAPACD, which is a coalition of more than 100 community-based groups that work to advocate in low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and neighborhoods. Seema was a founder and the former Executive Director of CHAYA CDC, which is a housing and economic justice organization based in Queens. And she was the head of that organization during and after 9/11, and that's what she'll be speaking to today. Also with us is Alberto Retana, who's the president and CEO of Community Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization in South Los Angeles that empowers residents there to transform their communities and reimagine public safety. Under his leadership, and Alberto actually joined Community Coalition in 1988, so he's been quite some time. Community Coalition created the People First platform, a comprehensive policy agenda informed by over 4,200 adults and youth to move resources to the highest need communities. Alberto will be talking to us about the lessons learned from working through the Great Recession. And also with us is Ashley K. Shelton, who's the Executive Director of the Power Coalition, a statewide 501c3 table in Louisiana that combines community organizing, issue advocacy, and civic action. Prior to that role, Ashley was the Vice President of Programs at the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, where she worked on response efforts related to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and she'll be talking to us from that vantage point. Welcome to all three of you. Before we get started, just a quick overview of our format today. I'm going to ask each of our panelists 2 rounds of questions. Encourage all of you who are listening to please put questions into the Q&A if you have any for our panelists, because then we'll move into that portion. And then we'll end with a call to action and recommendations. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question that I have, and we'll kind of get off screen now and just be us talking and everyone watching and listening. So the first kind of point of inquiry is, what are the similarities between the COVID-19 crisis and the emergency that you responded to? And what we'll do is start with Ashley and then move on to Alberto and Seema. Ashley, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much for having me this afternoon. And Deepa, I think this is such an important conversation and the opportunity to be a part of it. I think when we talk about the similarities between, COVID-19 and Katrina, I think it's just always true that the first thing that comes to mind is just the exposure of the amount of poverty and difference that exists in our communities, and the difference in people's ability to be able to cope, to be able to respond. These things kind of come up almost immediately when you start thinking about, like that, systemic and, structural racism has, put people of color at such a disadvantage, and that these disasters create, a mirror that just reflects back to us, the ways in which we have, kept, certain groups of folks from being able to, have the ability to work from home. Like, what a privilege it is to be able to have that. We find that a lot of, our essential workers are, people of color, and in particular, African-American women. When we talk about essential workers, I think what I worry about, with this particular disaster, when I think about kind of what's similar and what's different is that there's no economic engine for this disaster other than the federal government. And so at least, with the hurricane or disaster, typically there's rebuilding, houses, furniture, things have to be bought, and it kind of helps hold the, economy up until, things go, can get better. But I think that in this case, we don't have that. Which then draws, me to an even more important point, which is that, well, if the only engine is the federal government, then we have to make sure that those dollars come down in a way that's actually people-centered. And I think that that's also part of the similarity and the difference, is that we always want to solve with only a business-focused solution. And I am certainly a proponent of, business and the economy and all that great stuff, but I also understand that, like, again, like, people have been devastated by this virus, and do not have the ability to just, like, come out of this. We're coming out of quarantine here in Louisiana on Friday. And so what is the ability of someone that's not been able to work? They're 3 months behind on their rent. And then they're going to just kind of magically be able to, like, manage all of the things that we know are going to kind of come on the other side of quarantine, and especially for people living in poverty, especially for people of color. I mean, I think another thing that, and so I think, like, figuring out and defining what people-centered recovery actually looks like, and really talking about the fact that this moment is about reimagining these systems. The systems have been broken. We know they're broken. And I think that this, COVID, even more so than Katrina, has exposed, the brokenness of these systems, whether it be criminal justice, lack of affordable housing, not having enough transportation. I think that those are things that we've got to have real conversations about and really think about as we try to get the economy back up and running. How are people going to go to work if childcare centers aren't open? How can childcare centers open if if there are all these issues around this virus continuing to ravish our communities? There were just 612 new cases in Louisiana, and tomorrow we're open, right? I mean, it's crazy. It's a phase 1 opening, but it's still crazy. And then I think the other, point that I think is really important to make is, like, the trauma. We don't talk about what it means for people to have to, so many lives were lost in Hurricane Katrina. The inability to truly grieve, and even know where your loved one is, or, so we see some of those similarities with COVID, that, like, family members are dying and people are having to bury them without their families around them, and without access to a support system. And so I do think that piece of trauma that comes with just loss, and also to just the fear, right, of this virus and what's going to happen to your family if someone were to, contract, COVID-19, and your inability to kind of come out of this 17 days later from a hospital visit, if you're lucky enough to survive, and then carry medical debt, right? And thinking about all of these ways in which the dominoes fall in ways that keep, communities of color trapped in a cycle of poverty and criminalization. And I think that criminalization piece too sticks out for me. I mean, we're given citations to, folks, we've got stop points in Black communities, but you can go to Audubon Park and jog with no PPE on. Nobody's bothering you, no citations. And we've been fighting those things. And so again, like that movement building core, like those of us that have been on the ground fighting, we are going to continue to fight. And so, we've shut them down, but they're back. And so we're figuring out another way to ensure that they're not, disproportionately impacting communities of color with citations and things that don't help us recover from this. And so I know.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much, Ashley, and thanks for kind of opening with that phrase, a people-centered recovery. I think that that's something that is really helpful when we think about the framework for even reimagining, which we'll get to later. And I wanted to turn it over to you, Alberto, to talk a little bit about the Great Recession and some of the similarities that you see between that moment and this crisis today.
Thank you, Deepa. Thank you, everyone who have logged in, sending greetings from South Los Angeles to wherever you may be sitting in and zooming in from. So appreciative of all of you all joining us. Appreciative of Ashley's point around having a people-centered recovery effort. It's, I think, at probably the center of not just her point, but of why we're on this call today. So there's a lot that Ashley shared that I strongly and deeply connect with and agree with. And though Louisiana and Los Angeles, New Orleans and Los Angeles are very different, a lot of our people in South Los Angeles come by ways of Louisiana and New Orleans. So there's a lot of kinship in our neighborhood and yours. Though I'm 44 years old, though I've lived through crisis and read a lot about crisis and have dealt with the day-to-day crisis of working with people of color and oppressed people in the United States, this is my first crisis while in leadership, and my first crisis of this magnitude that has impacted my life personally, never before experienced. So while there have been other emergencies like 2008 and the other that have been given, this just seems qualitatively different to me in Los Angeles. What is not different, though, are the underlying economic and political system that our entire society relies on and depends on and functions off of. So in the normal day-to-day, there are those that have a lot, those that have some, and then those that don't have it all. This is the normal, and it's not okay, and it's never been okay. So we do our best to transform it. In a place like the United States with low levels of democratic action, for all of the reasons that we know that we won't get into, that is not about apathy, but about suppression, and decisions that are constantly being made for us, the underlying system stays covered, and we go on living our daily lives, struggling for our families. And while I hate the notion of gender reveals, because I'm incredibly critical of everything associated with a gender reveal party, I know a lot of my family members are involved in gender reveal parties. And one of the things that is actually happening right now is the great social reveal of what's happening. It's what people have talked about, the exposure. This is one huge social reveal that I think is demonstrating a few things that is similar to what 2008 happened. First thing is revealing that you've talked about very beginning is the structural inequality across race, class, gender, and all the other determinants that shape our society. Ultimately, the system is set up to protect private property and profit over people, that the national conversation is our willingness to let people die to get our economy off the ground, as if it's an either or question versus an and. At what point can we do both? And there's no reason why we need to throw lives away like, oh, it's only 5%, oh, it's only 1%, oh, it's only, at what point is no lives good enough? So I think ultimately it exposes the reveal of how private property and all of the white male heteronormative interests that are wrapped around that. Two, it reveals an actual assessment of power. We try to do power analysis every day in our work, but it's rare that we're able to really get a handle of what power looks like. And you really get a good sense of it when crises like these happens, who has it, who doesn't, in government, in philanthropy, in the nonprofit sectors. You'll see nonprofits that disappear. You'll see nonprofits that emerge. You see government leaders that rise in leadership. You see those that don't. You see decisions that are made. So the 2008 stimulus package and all the bailouts that took place, as well as some of the consumer protections, is a reflection of who actually has power. And right now, we know who has power in the White House. We know who has power in the Senate. We know who has power in the nonprofit sector. Much of that was revealed by the reports that Building Movement Project does, but certainly it's exposed even more so today in terms of who has power in the nonprofit sector. Which nonprofits are being called by their mayors and by their legislatures to inform what a quote unquote recovery effort looks like. All expose power for what it is and what it's not. The other thing that we learned, I think is very similar to 2008 to today, though, what did happen in 2008, we elected a Black president. So on some level, what point I'm about to make is somewhat more complicated and nuanced, but I think it still applies, which is that interventions are race neutral. And that is incredibly problematic when we've seen all the data point to the disproportionality on the impact on Black folks, Indigenous folks, Pacific Islanders in particular. It's incredibly problematic. We've learned that the COVID crisis, just like the economic crisis, the curve doesn't come in one way. It comes in multiple waves at different intensity at different levels. And so the race neutral response to a racist context is incredibly similar. The last thing I'll say about this and close out in terms of the similarities between 2008 and now is there's a great social reveal around our social and community values, both the good and the bad. So what is it about our country? What is it about our neighborhoods? What is it about our organizations that show that we are strongly, the rhetoric of, together we win. That's a very real, I fundamentally believe in that value, that coming together across race, across class, not doing so in a way that's ignoring of people's histories or context, but to actually come together is a big deal. And the fact that we're doing it in crisis represents the very best of our people. But it also exposes the social and community values that are problematic, that have been informed by individualism, rugged individualism of hoarding of resources, lack of resources, blaming each other, rather than actually having a society. Exposes the healthcare system and its inadequacies, the sickness of having overflowing emergency rooms, when in reality, that should never be, hospitals should never have been the first point of care in the first place. So it exposes a lot, and that's all I'll say right now. So structural inequality, power, race-neutral policies, our social and community values, and I'm just glad to be joining you all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberto. That was really helpful. And you gave us another phrase to go along with what Ashley started us off with, the great social reveal. Really appreciate that. And also the assessment of power and understanding that that actually goes across all sectors as well. So thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Seema now. In terms of, it's hard to believe, Seema, that almost 20 years have passed since 9/11. And I know both of us have been working in our communities all that time. So tell us a little bit about the similarities that you're seeing between what happened in the aftermath then and what's happening now.
Yes, thank you, Deepa, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I think a lot of what we're seeing, unfortunately is similar, to what we saw 2 decades ago. The social reveal, really surfaced, the issues that are relevant to the most vulnerable in our communities. I think the thing that really stands out to me is those that are most vulnerable, cash earners, undocumented, very small businesses, LEPs, seniors, those groups are really feeling this the most and did from the onset, and I think really need to be centered in the long-term, recovery and rebuilding. I'd say, as you pointed out, I was working in New York City with the South Asian and Muslim community in New York during 9/11. And, in addition to the trauma and the losses that people were experiencing at that time, the South Asian and Muslim communities also had multiple layers of impact. There was, of course, the economic loss. Lower Manhattan came to a standstill, and that meant all those people, from drivers to small business owners, people selling fruit on the streets, all were severely economically impacted. And because they were earning in cash in many cases, even simple things like documenting income so they could get the relief was a major challenge. So we're seeing a lot of those same issues emerge here. And then, of course, secondly, the harassment and heightened levels of discrimination that emerged post 9/11, that resulted in hate crimes, harassment in schools, job loss. I remember getting calls from different community members who were fired days after 9/11 because they were Muslim. So that is also happening. And then the last piece is, of course, the institutional response, and unfortunately, we probably will see more. But post 9/11, that was the special registration program, where hundreds of thousands of South Asian, Muslim, and others were rounded up at that time, none of which were found guilty of anything. But really, the fear that created in those communities really had a major impact in their ability to be resilient in those times. I think I thought it was worth sharing a quick story. My organization was working in a building in Astoria, Queens. We were organizing tenants, the majority who were from Bangladesh, who were Muslim. And, we had to quickly pivot from organizing those tenants who were getting ready to ask for repairs in their building to providing very basic assistance, making sure they got the food they need. As family members were literally disappearing, it was, helping them navigate that process, get legal support in navigating the special registration program. And so, basic needs like food and shelter were what we had to really refocus on. And so, I think the lack of the safety net also emerged in the immediate aftermath of when this pandemic really, came to its beginnings. And at that time, it was the faith-based institutions, the neighborhood businesses, and the really small community-based neighborhood organizations that really stepped up and responded and got people the food they needed and the support they needed because they had the relationships and were able to navigate the neighborhood. So, I think, again, during this period, we're seeing that happen. I think we're also seeing major gaps in small business support. We can talk about that later, but, I think that's one area that really surfaced for us, is the lack of infrastructure and support for small businesses. The fact that all these mutual aid funds have emerged around the country, is inspiring to see. And I think that shows the level of experience that our groups do have in crisis at this point, knowing that it couldn't just wait for government to come in and save communities, but really stepping up and creating those funds to try to really respond to immediate needs. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Seema. And thanks for really, I think the story was really instructive that you shared. And it also reminds us that nonprofits are continually having to pivot when it comes to addressing the immediate needs of our communities. But all three of you spoke about a lot of the similarities between past crises and today, ranging from the lack of adequate infrastructure, the failure of government, the social, the race class disparities that exist, as well as government policies that center profit, certain people, certain workers, and enforcement and criminalization of communities of color, and that the communities with the highest needs are not always centered, as Ashley started off talking about. So those are many of the similarities, but as you all alluded to, there are differences as well, right? And one of the things I wanted to ask you with the next question is really thinking about the ways in which our sector, nonprofits, community-based nonprofits, have engaged in, since the crises that you all talked about and worked on, a tremendous amount of advocacy and organizing, grassroots efforts, narrative shifts, policy work. What has happened when you look back? What are some of the lessons learned from that time when it comes to nonprofits, as well as perhaps government and philanthropy, that are lessons learned that we can utilize in this moment to uplift our communities and uplift the policy demands that we need to be making right now to reimagine the future, which will be the last question. But what is it that we can learn from the past, that we've practiced, that we've built, that we've collaborated on, whether it's nonprofits, government, or philanthropy, that you can lift up for us? So I want to start the second round with Alberto, and then Seema and Ashley. Alberto, go ahead.
Hi. I can only, I mean, it's an obvious point, but I want to make it explicit, I guess. I can only answer this question from the place I sit in South Los Angeles, which may be very different than Detroit, Michigan, or Navajo Nation, or in a community of Pacific Islanders who are impacted at 12 times the rate of white folks. So time, place, conditions, and context matters. So this is the story I share from my vantage point, and hopefully some of it will resonate, some of it might not. 30 years ago, a group of community leaders, activists, and line responders were brought together to address a crisis that was destroying Black families in particular. It was killing Black families, incarcerating them, separating them, suffocating them from their dignity and respect. You could probably think of a host of issues that could fall under that blank line. But that crisis in particular was the crack epidemic impacting South Central Los Angeles. It was a public health issue that was treated as a pathology, as a criminal issue, as an individual issue, as opposed to the undergirding sort of economic and social conditions that led to folks having to self-medicate in the first place. 2 years after we were founded to address that crisis, our city burned in flames, and South Central was the epicenter of the crisis. It was on national news with what many people call the LA riots. We call it the LA uprising. We had a chief of police at the time, so this begins to get at the differences. The conditions were very different then. We had a chief of police of Los Angeles at the time that said that Black people might be more likely to die from chokeholds because our arteries do not open as fast as they do in normal people. We had a Republican governor, we had a Republican state legislature. When the National Guard was called into LA to enforce martial law in Los Angeles, there was no access to elected officials, no real access to power. We couldn't get to the governor's office. So the National Guard was in cahoots with a racist chief of police and a Republican governor. And even though we had a Black mayor who was on our side most of the time, he was also squeezed out of power from the decisions that were being made. There was little in the way of mass organizations or people power institutions. Activists from across the board at that time were forced to meet in living rooms, basements, and secrets with little support from philanthropy. Outside of crisis, our legislature was passing policies like Proposition 187, 184, which are Trump-like policies of today. So while the underlying economic and political systems are the same today, our political organization power and formations were nascent. So what's different? 30 years later, California has emerged as a state of resistance, as Dr. Manuel Pastor points out in his book, and he documents the work that we've done over the last 30 years. We're now seen as a left-leaning alternative to Trump. And although there's a lot more we have to do in California, because make no mistake, California still has contradictions that we have to address. It did not happen by accident. It did not happen by random change in political attitudes. It did not happen because we're a majority people of color state now. It happened because of strategic, deliberate effort by activists in labor, civil rights, and community organizing to build and express power through mass organizations, politics, and voting. So as the COVID crisis hits us in LA, we're in a very different place today than we were 30 years ago. We have elected officials we can call. We have access to the governor's office. We have dozens of organizations. Every Saturday, 20 community leaders, people of color, leading organizations, Black, Brown, Asians, API folks, Native folks that are coming together to talk about how we build power and how we make sure that we don't have a race neutral response, which we'll get to in a second. So I'll just close by saying that while we have access power today, which we didn't have 30 years ago, we don't have seizure of power. So we still don't have the kind of power we need. We still have a way to go. And if we do our work, the California of 2050 will look far better than the California of 2020, which does look better than the California of 1990 when we first started. So progress is protracted. The organizing that we've done has been deliberate. And yeah, so that's all I would say about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alberto. And it's actually really helpful to hear about the history and the origins of Community Coalition and how things have progressed, as you said, not gotten where they need to be, but progressed. And I really want to lift up this point about building people-powered organizations, strategic, deliberate mass organizing that needs to be supported, that it doesn't just happen by accident. So thank you for that. Ashley, I want to turn to you. Actually, no, Seema, I'm going to turn to you next. And can you share with us a little bit about what are some of the lessons learned from the post 9/11 climate, right, and environment that puts nonprofits in perhaps a more strategic position than they were when 9/11 occurred?
Yeah, so, you know, I think, you know, there's a lot of growth that has happened over the past 2 decades in the nonprofit sector more broadly, you know, and that work is paying off now. You know, as Alberto said, you know, we still have a lot of work to do, but we have made progress as a sector. And, you know, post 9/11, we were calling some of our, you know, the organizations that we ended up partnering with for the first time in that moment of crisis. And I think the thing that has happened since then is, you know, our organizations have built our own capacity, and we have also built partnerships and built trust with other organizations across the sector. I think, you know, in that moment of crisis, we understood the importance of not just working in silos, but really building across. And so, you know, it has not been perfect, but we really, at this point, have relationships in place that were activated, you know, immediately upon this crisis hitting. So, you know, I think that trust building work that we have done over the years has really been helpful. The other thing is groups understanding where their strengths are and really figuring out where they can, you know, sort of enter this space and be most effective. I think we really did a lot of thinking about, okay, what are we doing now? What are our strengths and how can we contribute right in this moment, rather than trying to do everything and be everything to the community. So, you know, I think we have also learned about one another's strengths, and we're able to really, you know, participate from that perspective from the beginning. And so continuing to work through that. one example is, as soon as the first stimulus bill came out, which came really quickly, so we definitely were not equipped when that immediately came out. But immediately after, I think right away, the civil rights organizations and many others started to be in contact with one another and respond pretty quickly in terms of where we needed to weigh in and where we saw the gaps. So that was a sign of progress, and I think, it's particularly important right now where, really we have an administration that's hostile towards all of our communities. And so, there is that, that kind of shared interest bringing us together in terms of what we want to really see in the long run. And so, having built that trust, having had conversations about what the narrative should look like and what the longer term vision really should look like is paying off now. We still have a lot of work to do, but it's been helpful in terms of our ability to respond in this moment.
Thanks, Seema. Yeah, so the relationship building, the solidarity, the cross-movement work, getting out of the silos, and leaning into strengths, I think are all pieces of advice, to be honest, for maybe even nonprofits that are coming up right now in the wake of this particular moment to respond, to think about building. So thank you for that. So Ashley, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about best practices learned from Katrina. I know you've also worked in philanthropy and have that background. What are some lessons learned that put us in a better place right now to attend to what is evolving around us today?
No, for sure. And I have very similar points to Seema and Alberto about, like organizing and advocacy. I think, during Katrina, I was a funder on the funder side, and all we kept hearing from the national, kind of audience and funders and community was that there was no capacity here. And I think that that's the buzzword for let's not listen to Black and brown organizations on the ground, and we need to just bring all these folks to kind of parachute in and help us. And I think one of the lessons learned was that when I was at the foundation, we significantly invested in expanding and building out our policy and advocacy, as well as our organizing infrastructure, because we knew that no matter what, the federal money was going to far outweigh whatever philanthropic dollars we received. And so even though we had the Bush Clinton Katrina funds and other dollars, the reality was that was 50 million versus 50 billion. And I think that, helping people understand, fighting for those dollars to actually get to the ground is where the power was and where was the greatest opportunity. And I think that when I look at our advocacy, kind of community now, organizing and advocacy community, I am, I feel blessed, right? That I've got a whole team of folks that I can fight on the ground with. I think Seema's point about, leadership and building those relationships, everything that we have won and continue to win since, Katrina has been because there are a group of us, when all the folks leave, when there's nothing, when nobody feels like talking about your disaster anymore, there are those of us that, I tell folks, I said, everything I love is in this place. And so I'm not packing up. I'm not going anywhere. I've got to fight for my community and the people that I know are hurting, even still, as we try to repair the things that are there. And so I do think that having that network of leaders that holds the line about what we're going to allow to happen and not happen to the people that we're fighting for every single day, I think has been really, really powerful. I think it's also impacted our advocacy. It used to be that, hey, there are lots of smart folks that have lots of smart ideas about, the policy solution to any number of different problems. But for us, Katrina's actually pushed a bigger narrative about if directly impacted people are not a part of the advocacy solution, then why are we, it doesn't matter if you're smart enough to figure out what the answer is. People have, we need to actually have policy action informed by impacted people, period. And I think that those are the things that we kind of learned and kind of came out of, out of Katrina. I think, another thing that I'll lift up that I think is really important too, is being able to work along all levels of government. A quick story. After Katrina, it really was kind of the federal government and local municipalities that were in alignment, and we were kind of fighting the state at the time. And so, if we couldn't get some alignment around housing issues or how some CDBG dollars would be spent, I could call my fellow New Orleanian who just so happened to be working at HUD, and, he just keeps the application on his desk until we could have a community conversation about what the solution was. And so, I think that, it's unfortunate with this administration that, we don't have those same kind of connections, but we were able to build, power along both the local, state and federal, lines, and really talk about the fact that, before we brought community to DC and to talk about what was actually happening to impacted communities following Katrina, the congressional body had never heard from anybody from our states, right? They'd heard from our congressional leaders, but that's not the same as, a grandmother who's lost her home, every photo she ever took, these things that, were really powerful, kind of stories of what had happened to people. And so that's that other piece is also making sure that we're bringing directly impacted people into these conversations and keeping them front and center. And, I think we keep talking about essential workers, but, another point would be around data, right? We're trying to race, we open up as a state on Friday, but we're trying to race to make sure we have as much data as possible to be able to tell the story of what's happening to essential workers in our state, who they are, how much money they're making. Are they getting hazard pay? Do they have access to PPE? So that when, whenever the story is told, that you actually, we can prove what we know is happening to people. And, I always tell folks, I only care about data for the purposes of policy action, which is always my filter, right? Because, we can get lost in that, but I do think it is important for that particular instance of making sure that we can tell the stories of what's happening to people. And then I think, one thing that has come up time and time again, we've talked to folks in Puerto Rico, we've shared our stories with other folks that have been living in disaster or experiencing disasters. And one thing that when we do these conversations that comes up time and time again, unrehearsed, is, that we have to think about the children. And I think that, and it kind of struck me that, even though we were doing housing and workforce and training, the reality was that, that we had to understand the trauma that had happened to our children, and that our children were growing up in the relief and recovery phase. And it was also painful, and, and everybody wasn't recovering in the same ways, and the recovery dollars didn't come down, in fair, kind of thoughtful ways. And I would just close by saying too, be careful of the words, right? People talk about how resilient and beautiful the people of Louisiana are. And I always remind folks that we are a beautiful, resilient people. I said, but if you do not change the things that force me to be resilient, which means I'm stretching myself for a short period of time, it's just oppression, and you don't need to dress it up and use a pretty word to call it what it is.
That's super powerful. Thank you for saying that, Ashley, because I think that is a word that's used to describe our kids, our communities, people of color, right? They're resilient, they're going to be okay. And I think that sometimes it doesn't really tend to what needs to be dismantled, that it's not just keeping wrong all the time, right? That the systems need to change. The burden is not always on us. So thank you again to all three of you for laying out some of the ways in which communities have built power. Some of the themes that you brought up were the importance of building people-powered organizations that are focused on mass organizing. We talked about the access to power that has been gained, particularly in all levels of government, and how to actually use that power to our advantage. Talking about the importance of trust and relationship building, working across silos, across movements, beyond our silos, but also being really clear about what we're good at and we're effective at. And the importance of kind of thinking about narrative and what the narratives are that are being told. So really appreciate the wisdom and the insights, and I want to go into a little bit of time for Q&A. So there are a couple of questions that have come up, and I'm going to probably, I might just ask, I'm going to tell you all the questions, so you might want to write them down. I'll repeat them again, and I'll try to direct them to each of you in a particular way. So Seema, there was a question that came in specifically for you on the chat, which I'll just ask you to respond to. And that question was around how has your organization pivoted to respond to this particular crisis, and what kind of help do you all need, particularly, from perhaps philanthropy or partners? That would be really helpful to hear. If others want to talk about the help need, that's fine too, feel free, but that question came in specifically for you. A second question that I want to ask Ashley to talk about is this piece around how do you shape the narrative of a crisis, and how people are understanding that crisis, both in the moment, but also actually in terms of future. And so when you look back, you talked about it a little bit already, but when people think about Katrina or Rita, how do we shape the narrative so it isn't one or the other, binary? So the question also asked about archiving and telling stories. You know, how can that help in shaping the narrative fully? And then for you, Alberto, a question around you know, oftentimes philanthropy responds in terms of providing emergency funds or rapid response funds in terms of crisis, in terms of the crisis. But as you talked about, how does philanthropy, or how should philanthropy think about investing in organizing and people-powered movements that go well beyond the immediate crisis? So could you talk about the balance of that? So those are the three questions. I can repeat them again if you need. And I really appreciate what's going on in the Q&A. A lot of folks are expressing a lot of love for the three of you, inspired by the three of you. So it really says, you know, powerful, grounded leaders of color with a focus on working counterculturally to intentionally center those most impacted in this time of crisis and in the long term. I couldn't have said it better. So really want to just thank you all for what you're talking about and working on. So Seema, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Ashley, and then we'll go to Alberto.
Great, thank you, Deepa, and thank you for all the support and love from the attendees. You know, I guess in terms of how we're pivoting, you know, immediately after, I have to say I really appreciate how philanthropy is being flexible in this moment. You know, we you know, immediately started to talk to our member organizations and just set up lines of communication to really hear like what's going on the ground. For me, this was difficult because I have always worked in community, so having shifted to the national level, in the immediate, it was challenging for me. I wasn't quite sure, you know, what is the role that we should play, but we decided to do a number of things. You know, one, get resources to our groups because they were responding immediately and needed to fill gaps, and we're fronting all those costs. So, you know, whatever support we could provide for them. We're making sure we're creating spaces for our members to share strategies across. So through webinars, through collecting of resources. For us, language access is a major issue. So we're also, wherever member organizations are translating materials, we're simply just sharing them across, and it is helping because we're able to cover languages that are often ignored, you know, from the Pacific Islander languages to South Asian, Southeast Asian, those are always left behind. So we're also just sharing resources. In terms of what we're trying to do now as an organization, you know, we're trying to raise funds. I know there are a lot of funds out there. We didn't want to compete with our member organization, so we haven't been very public, but we've been appealing to institutional donors to contribute. And really want to provide flexible funding to groups on the ground to really do what they're doing. We're also trying to invest more in storytelling. You know, one appeal to philanthropy would be, you know, everybody wants us to tell stories, but we need resources to do that work. You know, we have a one-person communications team, and so, you know, really trying to do what we can to collect stories and engage our partners in that work, but really from the grassroots to our level, we do need support to do that work, and we know how important it is. Yeah, and then lastly, a lot of policy advocacy efforts. We don't have the capacity. We need to really push for our communities on the national level. So, you know, we have been trying our best, and partnerships are helping, but really I think we need increased capacity in that area as well.
Thanks, Seema. I think a lot of folks are probably nodding at what you're saying because they're in the same boat, listening in, that there are just a myriad of needs, and yet, you know, it's oftentimes really difficult to keep meeting them over and over. So thank you for just laying those out. Ashley, on to you, and the question around narrative. How do we shape narratives that are people-centered and that are really being faithful to the experiences of communities that often get left out of the story altogether?
No, for sure. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm, like that I think for this, as we kind of come into COVID, one of the things that we had done before, we were all quarantined was that we brought together all the policy groups around the state that are working on different issues and really kind of understood what the work was of each of the groups around the state, what were they trying to change and move within those issue area groups. The filter also was this, were these policy recommendations coming from, from a space of impacted people. And we quickly turned what would have been our policy agenda for the legislature into a roadmap, right? And so one of the things that we did was we took every issue area and we gave recommendations to our state government, our governor, who is also one of the most, he's constitutionally one of the more powerful governors in the country, and are really, really leading with narratives around paid sick leave. And, really too, like we keep talking about, like, it's been interesting that like a lot of the federal solutions are the solutions that many of us have been fighting for all along. It's like, $600 extra in your unemployment is $15 an hour. If we really want to address COVID, people, like 45% of the people in the state of Louisiana don't have 1 day of paid sick leave. And so what we've been doing is just, creating a bully pulpit. One of, we sent the policy, the roadmap to every legislator. We printed it out and sent it to every legislator. We've had great conversations with Congressman Richmond and his office about like why do we pick up certain policies, or why do we mention certain things over the other? And so I just think it's about, just pushing. I mean, we've been pushing, with some national media and asking some of our state, partners like State Voices and others to kind of help us with our comms, because like Seema said, I mean, we just don't have the comms capacity to like bombard, but we just do a lot of op-eds and we help our partners do op-eds. And so, it's just about like who has capacity and how do we spread that capacity amongst the partners that we work with. But I do think that, it's sticking, right? And so it's making it much harder for our legislature that's in session right now that'll be talking about another paid sick leave bill, that we're pushing. And interestingly enough, like they killed one, but this one, we're asking the harder questions and really challenging them and really creating some media around, like, do you want, like how are we going to protect our workers? How are we, if the economy is the only thing you care about, how are we actually going to center people? Right. And so I do think that, like, on the narrative side, that it's a combination of a bunch of stuff. It's op-eds, it's, getting the, I always make comments on these national and regional reports that come out about what's happening to people in Louisiana so that I can, kind of really, kind of project back what our reality is. Mm-hmm. And then that's the last thing that I'll say, and then also to using moments, organizing moments to then tell a broader story. So all of the sanitation workers are striking in New Orleans. And our partner, Voice of the Experience, has some COVID, relief dollars, and they're going to allow them, 2 weeks. They're trying to figure out what the exact amount is, but help support them while they're on the line, so that strike can create a basis for a larger conversation about essential workers, about mm-hmm. safety, and about like what needs to happen when we talk about essential workers. And so also using moments of organizing to really kind of tell a bigger story. Right. Because, like getting your trash picked up is real and personal to every single person. And at the end of the day, if you can't get connected to the plight of folks that are suffering, like it's these kind of demonstrations that help connect people. And so we've also been just trying to use those to build campaigns mm-hmm. and communications.
That's great. I think that's really important to talk about those moments, or those organizing moments. And the other piece that I've heard you talk about a lot is how you all utilized a racial equity framework from the beginning, using a concept that a lot of other folks had not heard about to shift the narrative again and shape it. So thank you. Alberto, the question around, why is it important that philanthropy stays on the scene after the fire is out, right? Or ostensibly the fire is out, and the importance of investing in people-centered mass organizing movements?
Well, I think the opening quote by Ella Baker about looking back at history to look towards the future is incredibly relevant when we're thinking about philanthropic investment. There are no shortcuts to solving inequality. There are no shortcuts to solving the brutal, divisive, and dehumanizing impacts of capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all that we're trying to work on. And so I think that oftentimes in moments of crisis and disaster, everyone gets executive-like and starts making executive decisions. And whether you're on the left or on the right, in either case, let's just stick to our folks, it could compromise our values of democratic action. And to Ashley and Seema's point of how do we make sure that those furthest, those that are most impacted by the problems, that are generally furthest from the decision-making table, are actually smack in the middle to help shape and define what the future looks like. I think it's easy for me as an executive at an organization that is grounded in the community to move into executive action. And so we all have to ground ourselves in values and practices to ensure that the people that we claim to be at the center are always at the center and are anchoring the decisions we make. And the same goes with philanthropy, especially as philanthropy comes out and says that they really want to get behind the people. So with that in mind, I think there's three particular things. There's a lot of things. I have like 10 things that we can, but I'll only share three things that I think philanthropy can do in this period to learn from the past. Because what we've learned from the past, one thing we've learned from the past is that one thing philanthropy has not invested in, at least in LA, and I would venture to say it's probably took the place after Katrina, and certainly took place after 9/11, definitely took place after 2008, definitely took the place after 92. All these disasters, is organizing was not where all the money went. Organizing was probably where the least amount of resources went. All of the other resources went elsewhere. So I believe that there are three things that philanthropy can do. One, they need to start they need to lead by following. They need to not lead by leading. They need to lead by following, by listening to those that are directly impacted, by bringing in folks that are typically not in their kitchen cabinets to actually inform where their money goes, how they spend and how they invest, and to actually engage folks on what does organizing look like and get behind that, as opposed to just doing service delivery, mutual aid, or build out a social service sector, which is absolutely important, but all that does is mitigate inequality, doesn't solve it, which leads me to the second point, which is the second thing they need to do besides lead by following people of color too. There was a coalition in LA of 100 groups, like 80% of the leaders were like white people. I was like, what's going on? Like that can't happen. Our white allies have got to do a better job of thinking about who's at the table, who's advocating, not just people of color, but our folks, but so leading by following people of color. But the second thing is to solve, the second thing I would encourage the philanthropy to do is to solve inequality. Stop trying to mitigate against capital and help solve the actual contradictions that exist. That means you divest in funds that don't help, right? So you have stocks, you have hundreds of millions of dollars in the stock market, take it out of fossil fuel industry, take it out of the banking industries that are hurting our communities, the pipelines, and invested in clean energy, invested in the things that are actually growing, invest in the things that matter, and that helps us in terms of the economy. And also invest in bold solutions. So really go after the organizations that are doing work on the ground. The third thing, and I'll just end with, is that they just need to spend more. So lead by following, solve inequality, spend more. Let go of this 5%, right. Go spend 20%, spend down your resources, get the money to us, create flexibility, do automatic renewals for the next 2 years, make it easier for us to live out the freedom dreams that we all have for our communities, as opposed to setting all the restrictions.
Right.
Libra Foundation, Crystal Haling, Black woman, amazing leader, is doing just that at the Libra Foundation. I think she's a good example of where to look to.
That's great. Great to do the shout out. Yeah, because the scope and depth of this crisis, as you all have mentioned, is larger, deeper than any of the other crises perhaps that we have talked about, right? And so the investments have to mirror that as well. So I think that's a really important point. So we're getting to the close of our webinar. Really appreciate folks continuing to stay on. That's because of your power and your insights. Just for the panelists, there are a lot of questions that did come to each of you. So if you want to go in there and respond to those, I encourage you to do that if you have time. So I want to end, the last question here is really the call to action, right? Each of your organizations has, I think, put out a policy platform with some demands about what to do to reimagine and rebuild. I'm curious to know if you could share one of those bold ideas and about whatever systems change you think needs to happen at this time, right? And also, when you share it, if you could talk about what nonprofits need to do, as well as government or philanthropy, when you're thinking about that big systems change. So we'll start with Seema and then go to Ashley and Alberto. Seema? Oh, you're on mute, Seema.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully as we move to the rebuilding part of this work, I mean, definitely we want to look at solutions that are, you know, more equitable and inclusive. Definitely don't want to just recover and go back to the way things were. They were not working for our communities. I mean, I think in terms of the bold solutions that we need to be thinking about now, I mean, you know, two things that I really want to lift up. You know, one is, you know, around the economic recovery. You know, maybe this is getting a little too specific, but, you know, to my point around small businesses and micro enterprises, you know, I think these small businesses, ironically, are why people had moved into our cities, why we spent the last decade, you know, working around gentrification and displacement. Those same businesses that brought people in are at risk of being lost right now. And so we really need to, you know, think about solutions that, you know, all of the relief that's been offered to small businesses has been focused on very large businesses, larger corporations, you know, even the MBDA, the Minority Business Development Association, you know, they work only with businesses that are above $1 million in budget size. You know, that leaves out so many portions of our economy and things that drive our cities. So I think really thinking about resourcing the very grassroots and smaller size businesses. And I think on the housing side, you know, all the relief is focused on, the industry is focused on home ownership in general. You know, I think if you look at housing programs that are being pushed out on the federal level, all of it is focused around home ownership, when in fact, you know, the majority of low-income people are renters, not even just low-income folks. So I think, you know, shifting our focus to renters and shared equity models, land trusts, and cooperatives, you know, those are the ways we can build wealth and include everyone in those strategies. So I think, you know, broadening those types of solutions, you know, lastly to what Alberto pointed out on the, you know, we're having mass unemployment now. How do we take this opportunity to retrain people, retrain workers to really work in industries that will address climate change and things like that, where, you know, there are growing areas. If we have so many unemployed, there's an opportunity there to really invest in those areas that we really need to at this point.
Thanks so much, Seema. Thanks for kind of laying out the housing, the solidarity economy pieces and asks. I want to turn to Ashley. What about some bold solutions? I know you all have a policy platform. I think someone already shared the link over the list here. So tell us one thing that you want to really hone in on that folks should know about.
I think, you know, like I mean, like we looked at a lot of things. I mean, I think that the two that really popped, but I'll talk about criminal justice because I think that that's one of the more powerful issues that we have to address as a state and certainly as a city in New Orleans, but also to economic opportunity. That I think that, again, like these systems are broken and there's no other moment in this moment to know how broken they actually are. And I'll tell you, and I think my other panelists would agree that you know, like we're in the kind of calm before the storm, and I think that, you know, it's kind of quiet, and like there are bad things happening, but they're not, you know, they don't, you know, like you don't feel them like, but you're gonna feel them in 60 days. You're gonna feel, you know, some of the ugliness that exists in our leadership, our elected leaders. And so, you know, one of the things that we really focused on that I think was really powerful was really looking at criminal justice reform. You know, New Orleans is, you know, is one of the most incarcerated, is the most incarcerated place in the world. And so we have worked with our partner, Voice of the Experienced, Vote, led by Norris Henderson, you know, to really offer up to our state several recommendations around, you know, like keeping people safe, around addressing the fact that, like, you know, we're putting people in a no-win situation around their lives. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. And so, you know, the governor, you know, was responsive and did let some folks out, but not nearly at the level of recommendation that we had made around, you know, letting folks that were that had medical conditions, you know, letting them have furlough, giving folks, you know, like that already were getting ready to get out, like giving them those 1-800 days and just letting them out, you know, letting them go home or return home. But also too, even more powerful is the juvenile justice space. You know, we are as powerful too, was that, you know, so the statute, the literal state statute says that juvenile justice is about rehabilitation. It is not punishment. And the idea that we could not, or we are still fighting to get our juveniles released and sent home to their parents and their families has been extremely frustrating. And so we have laid out, you know, like really clear policies about what needs to happen for our incarcerated communities around the state. We also too, unfortunately, have 12 detention centers around our state because we did so much criminal justice work and ended some of you know, closed some of those facilities, and now they're just using them for detention centers. And so for us, like, you know, being able to like really call them on the injustices and the treatment and the things that are going to be necessary to prioritize life, I feel really good about those policies. And so there's a link to the doc in there. There are any number of things. But I think that that's really important because I think that we're going to see more criminalization. And so we need to make sure that we have a response. Last thing is that this federal money is going to come down. There's $1.8 billion in Louisiana right now. And the people that they've chosen to program those dollars are really great leaders in our community. But do they really understand what we know as activists about these dollars and how they really need to be put in the community to help? And so I just, you know, say, like, build power, continue to fight, build voice, because that's the thing that's going to get us to a people-centered recovery. Right. Because I promise, I love all of them, but, you know, I don't, you know, they're all good people, but I don't know if they know what I know about, you know, making sure that people are okay. So that's it. Thank you. Sorry.
No, that's great. No, that's great. Thank you so much. And we'll also send along those resources and links when we do our follow-up email. The Free Them All campaign is why folks, you know, could get more information about this, also national around the country. So Alberto, could you share a little bit about some of the bold solutions that we need to be paying attention to right now?
There's a ancestor of all of ours who I try to carry her message with me in the work that we do by way of Detroit, Michigan, a revolutionary activist, organizer by the name of Grace Lee Boggs. And she would ask the question, what time is it in the clock of the world? And I think there's no more relevant time, at least in my life, to be asking that question than right now. We should all, and of course, context, place, all matters, both our global connection, but then in our own unique backyards. And for me, one piece of that is, if we go back to where we were, then we failed. And for Los Angeles and for California, what's in front of us, though there are still huge social contradictions we have to resolve, largely because we're in a liberal state as opposed to a real progressive state as a step towards a more revolutionary outcome. So for me, the clock of the world that ticks is, how do we move California and LA from a liberal place to a more progressive place? That's a very different question in a very different place, depending upon where you sit. But for us, that's the contribution we can make that will hopefully contribute to the rest of the country and to the rest of the world. And part of that means we need to move from, as a framework, away from recovery to, and I think I need help in figuring out what the two is, but away from recovery to reconstruction. To recover is to return to what was taken, and well, for many, we've never had. So we can't just recover. We have to reconstruct something better, something new, that takes us away from where we were. Recovery would mean that the emergency wins we would have made in this period in California would disappear. It would mean that we've reduced our jails from 17,000 to 13,000. They were built for 13,000. There's activists pushing that right now. Now they're suing them to get more folks released. If we go back and then we send everybody back in jail, then we haven't achieved. If we now have folks that are unhoused, that are in hotel rooms, that should be permanent. But if we go back to the way we were, they'll be back on the streets, and we'll have 60,000 folks continuing to live on the streets of Los Angeles. If we go back to where we were, right now we've eliminated the SAT as a reason to go into the UC system in California. Why? Because white kids all of a sudden are dealing with the level of oppression that they didn't get to deal with before, something that our communities have been facing for generations. The SAT's gone for now. If we go back to where we were and bring it back, then we failed, and we've continue to establish the liberal state. So part of our job is to make sure that the wins we've made in California, we've made permanent to create space for other places to do the same. How do we achieve equity and racial justice as a centerpiece of any road to recovery? That would be a huge effort. The fact that Angela Glover Blackwell was involved as one of the key conversations of Governor Newsom's cabinet releasing it is a huge victory. But the mayor of Los Angeles needs to do the same thing. There is no real racial justice czar in Los Angeles. That would be a move and a step forward. So we have to change our organizing strategy, our alliance building. We have to change the White House. We don't change the White House, and we don't change the outcome of who's in the Senate, then we're going to not go back to where we were. We're going to go backwards. So for me, the clock of the world is ticking. I'm hearing it. We have a responsibility to organize around it now more than ever. And the fact that we can build, and I'll just end on this, for me, solidarity is absolutely critical. Without multiracial solidarity that centers Black lives and the most marginal voices at the front lines, we will lose. We have to build the solidarity needed. And we got to get our white folks to get themselves together to actually fall in line and get behind what we're trying to build. We're going to build a kind of society that lives, breathes the dignity, respect, and freedom that our ancestors have been striving for us to do. So that's where we're headed.
Thank you. That is really powerful. Saw a lot of snaps, agree, and appreciate that we've been able to bring in two ancestors, Ella Baker and Grace Lee Boggs, into this conversation. That gives me a feeling of being grounded and really anchors the conversation that we've been having. So we're gonna actually move back to the slide deck to close out with a couple of slides and synthesis. I felt like this conversation was amazing. You know, one of the key things that I want to just keep shouting out is the fact that we can't return, there's no normal to return to, right? And so how do we preserve any gains that we're having right now for the long run? So just really quickly want to end with some recommendations that we put together at Building Movement Project and Solidarity Is that really amplify what you all said. For philanthropy, for nonprofits, the importance of coordinating and collaborating across, really building that multiracial solidarity that you talked about, Alberto. Also focusing on sustainability and well-being, because a lot of us are dealing with vicarious and direct trauma. Ashley talked about this, and really important to think about nonprofit sustainability for people of color who are leading. Leading with a community-centered equity framework, all of you mentioned this time and again, and holding philanthropy and government accountable. I think Alberto said something like, we may have access to power, but we also need to be able to actually hold that power accountable to us and for us. The next slide speaks to some recommendations for philanthropy, again, that you all mentioned. So that philanthropy, if it has this racial equity frame, right, that a lot of philanthropy, members of philanthropy talk about, how is that actually being practiced, especially now? Scaling up investments to meet the depth and scale of this crisis in really bold ways, taking risks with new organizations that are just starting to work with communities, and really balancing that emergency response funding with long-term power building investments. And then lastly, some recommendations for government, also amplifying what you all have said, putting people first, really thinking about actually systems and plans and policy that put people first, having plans in place that are actually informed by community needs, that make sure that the recovery as well as the relief efforts are coming from community. Seema mentioned the importance of that post 9/11. That didn't happen when government was not really an ally, and kind of the similarities here, but maybe at the state and local level, it could be different, as Ashley and Alberto talked about. And then implementing systems change, that some of the systems that we have been talking about don't work. And so it is not about making them work again, but actually to dismantle them and to rebuild something new. So those are just some recommendations we wanted to share. And again, really, really want to thank every single one of you for joining. Appreciate the messages that you've been leaving in the Q&A. Appreciate the questions that you've had. And I want to just take a moment again to thank Seema Agnani, the Executive Director of National CAPACD, Alberto Retana, the President and CEO of the Community Coalition in Los Angeles, Ashley Shelton, the Executive Director of the Power Coalition in New Orleans, Louisiana, for your wisdom, your ability to speak truth in really an unfiltered but very powerful way, and the commitment that you have to your communities for decades, right? For decades, as you all talked about all these crises, I could just feel the amount of work and commitment and time you've been put in. But as Ashley said, like, these are the people that we care about, right? We're not just leaving. So really want to thank you for the work you're doing and the vision that you are putting out there and have been for some time. With that, just some closing slides. Just want to remind folks again that BNP is really trying to uplift voices like Seema's, Ashley's, and Alberto's, and other nonprofit executive directors of color. We want to try to understand the effects of COVID-19 on our communities, but also on our organizations. And so we ask you to, by Friday, complete the survey. It takes 10 minutes. We'll share the link out again. We'd really appreciate you taking it, but also sending it to 2 other folks who are people of color, so that we can actually hear from the people that are affected the most and that are leading in this moment. We just put the survey out to everyone as well on chat, so you should get the link there. And then lastly, just want to thank you all for being part of this series of conversations. Please learn more about our work. You can go to buildingmovement.org to learn about the reports, the resources, the trainings, and all that we're trying to offer in this moment, and have been for 20 years now. And really, again, appreciate the wisdom and insights shared here. So with that, we're going to close and give you back 7 minutes of time that we had prepared for this webinar, because I know we need it, because what time on the clock is it, right? So appreciate everyone for being here. Stay safe and healthy, and look forward to connecting with you all again. Thank you.